Okay, I think we can start. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Santo Fortunato. I'm professor of informatics here at SAIS and the director of the Indiana University Network Science Institute. I'm super happy to do this introduction today, although I was not supposed to, because I've been chasing Brian for a while, and I'm a physicist of background, and I've always been interested, I took reproducibility for granted for a long time. So I come from a field where if nothing is reproduced, if something is not reproduced, it's not true, or it's not believable, even if it could be believable. So when I then changed field, I started working in these things, I realized that in other disciplines, this concept is not so strong as it is in physics. So it was with the big pleasure that I know that there was somebody who was really investing a major part of his time to lay strong foundations about reproducibility in the social sciences and hopefully in the future also in any science, because like I said, I don't really believe in something which is not reproducible. It's one of our principles here at IU, and certainly at IUNI. It's one of our research directions, right? Best practices. So sharing things, open access, everything we can to favor the scientific discourse and reproducibility of results. So Brian is also a professor at the University of Virginia in psychology, and he's the founder of the Open Science Institute in Virginia still, that I would like to visit at some point. He led in 2011, the Reproducibility Project, which was supposed to check whether 100 psychology experiments were actually reproducible. And he found that only 36 of them were. So about, right? So we'll tell probably the story a bit better. So let me then welcome Brian Nosek here. We're very happy to have him here and very excited to hear what he's going to tell us. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm pleased to be able to have a chance to present to you today. My core research interest is in the gap between values and practices, what we think we should do, what we want to do, what we're trying to do, versus what we actually do in our everyday behavior. And most of the work that we've done in the lab about that is on how it is we're influenced by thoughts and feelings that we may not be aware of or may not be able to control, and how the context in which we make decisions may shape those decisions through motivated reasoning, doing things that are benefit to us without us necessarily recognizing that our reasoning is rationalization. That's a good route for me, so it's the right route to pursue, rather than it's the right route to pursue, so I just better do it whether it's good for me or not. The Center for Open Science is a practical application of that general research interest, which is in the gap between scientific values and scientific practices, what we idealize science to be and operate, on how it actually operates in everyday practice. And our pragmatic goal is to try to align those. How can we change the culture, incentives, and norms so that people can behave according to the values that they hold for the discipline, with the idea being that that will be what will help maximize the efficiency of science, the pace of science in discovery and finding out things that we can rely on and translating those things into applications to improve humanity. So what I'd like to do today is give you sort of the big picture introduction to the challenge as we see it for improving transparency and reproducibility, and then an overview of a culture change strategy and how is it that we can shift the research culture to embracing activities that will lead to a more reproducible and more efficient science overall. And I'll be happy to have feedback of any kind of any of these parts, and you're welcome to interrupt at any time with questions for how it is that we might be able to adapt this to be as applicable and relevant and effective as possible across the domains that you know. So to start, we should begin with, if that works, which it doesn't. So I don't know if I have to turn it on. So there's something that needs to be fixed there, but we'll begin with the what are the values of science? Try again. So fast. That's good. What are the values of science? And we can refer to lots of different ways of characterizing those, but the ones that I like to use the most for this is talking about Robert Merton's norms of science. Merton defined these norms of science in the 1940s and 50s, where he tried to characterize what is it that makes science or scholarship distinct as ways of knowing things about the world compared to other ways that we might approach knowing things about the world. And he identified 4 norms, and then you can characterize the counter norm away from those. So a norm of communality, the open sharing of information. A scientific claim doesn't become credible because I say, trust me, just trust me. It becomes credible based on you being able to review the methodology that I used, the data that I generated, the inference process that I applied to those data to come to the claim that I make at the end. And that is the basis of scientific knowledge becoming credible or not, as opposed to the counter norm secrecy. No, just trust me. Likewise, the norm of universalism. Research is evaluated on its own merit rather than saying, well, we have to believe that result because that person's famous. And so because they've made other results that are right, then this one must be right too. Disinterestedness. Researchers are motivated by knowledge and discovery versus the counter norm of self-interestedness. Really, all I'm trying to do is get a job. I'll do whatever it takes to get a job and keep a job, get ahead of everyone else around me. Right? Or organized skepticism. A scientist considers all new evidence, even against their prior work, as opposed to organized dogmatism. I get my dissertation findings and then I spend the rest of my career defending them against all of the attackers who would like to bring down my claims. And while Merton didn't talk about it, there is commonly discussed a norm of quality as opposed to a counter norm of quantity. So you might look at those and say, I recognize those as norms that have been discussed about science. But an obvious question is whether researchers themselves endorse those norms compared to the counter norms. What do you think people believe should be the way that science operates? Anderson and her colleagues did a survey of that, where they surveyed about 3,300 NIH awardees. In this case, early career were researchers in postdoctoral positions. Mid-career were those that were in their first R01 awards. The average age of that sample is about 40. And what I'm showing you here is just the cumulative plot of their people's endorsements of the norms over the counter norms. So in gray, you're seeing about 90% of the sample said that they endorse the norms over the counter norms on average. In black are those that said, no, I endorse the counter norms over the norms. I think it should operate as self-interestedness and dogmatism, et cetera. You'll see very few people. And then in the hatches are people who said these are about equally weighted on average. So there is basically universal endorsement of those norms or close to it. But then they said, okay, don't tell me what you endorse, what you think it should be like. Tell me how you behave in your work. What do you do in your everyday science? And it looks like this, right? So about 60% of people saying I behave according to the norms of science over the counter norms. But a much more substantial minority now say that those counter norms have some influence on my behavior. And still very few are saying that they behave according to the counter norms over the norms. So they said, okay, thank you, that's great. Don't tell me what you do. Tell me what the other people in your field, what do they do? It looks like this. Right? So almost everyone endorses how they think science should operate. They mostly say that they behave according to those, but they do not perceive the culture around them to be embracing and acting on those norms of science. And that is the cultural challenge that we confront, right? If I think that my values are not things that are incentivized, rewarded, embraced in the community that I'm in, then I'm confronted with a difficult decision to make. I can live according to my values of how I think science should operate, and as a consequence, disadvantage my career advancement because other people are doing things that are in their self-interest rather than in the interest of science. Or I could give up on the values that I have about how I think science should be done, and instead do things that will be career advancing, even though I don't actually want to be behaving in that way. So that is a deep challenge that we create in people, a conflict of interest. Right? What's good for me versus what's good for science. What I think it should be like versus what science could be like. And so for us, the culture change intervention we will know succeeded is when we can align these together so that what my values are as a member of this community are reflected in what the community values. And the fact that essentially everyone has those values, but those same people perceive the rest of us all around us as not having those values, shows how much it's embedded in the actual culture of how science operates rather than in the individuals that are trying to do the best they can in the scientific culture. So there's lots of ways we might characterize what is the cultural challenge. For us, it boils down to this as the key element, which is that the incentives for my success as an academic are focused on me getting it published, not on me getting it right. I want to get it right. I got into science because I'm curious and I want to figure things out. I want to get towards truth the best that I can. But what matters for my getting my job, for me keeping my job, for me advancing the career is publishing as much as I can in the most prestigious places that I can. And we know that not everything gets published. It's not just a matter of doing good science. There are some things that are more likely to get published than other things. I'm more likely to get published for finding a positive result rather than a negative result. More than 90% of published findings are positive results. Doesn't look like that in the lab. I'm more likely to get published by getting a novel finding, something that shows something new about the world rather than repeating or improving the evidence for an existing claim about the world. I'm more likely to get published with a neat and tidy story where all the evidence fits together in a package where my conceptual explanation for why it occurred is all supported by all of the empirical evidence. Rather than something that shows, well, it doesn't quite fit here, and our explanation doesn't account for this variable, and where this is a little bit of a mess, and we're not sure here. So a positive, novel, tidy paper is the best kind of paper. And that's because it is the best kind of paper. If you discover something new that actually has some explanation about this treatment having some impact or these things being related in the world, and all of your evidence fits together, that's amazing. That's an amazing contribution to science. But the reality is that most of what we do doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like that because we're studying things we don't understand. That's why we study them. And that studying means that there's lots of false starts. There's lots of things that don't fit together. There's lots of parts that we don't get. And the emergent understanding of a theoretical explanation that's well supported in empirical data takes a long time to get to. Longer than it takes for any individual paper we produce to get to. But all of the incentives are make it as beautiful as you can, as wonderful as you can, as clean as you can, right? And so that is a significant challenge for how is it that researchers decide to behave and what decisions do they make around the research life cycle. And as we know, going around that research life cycle, there are many opportunities at every stage for the discretion, for the choices that I make to have impact on the credibility of the claims that I produce. And those opportunities then, again, reinforce that conflict of interest. There are things that I might do at different stages of the process that improve publishability at the cost of credibility, right? We get data in the lab. We have many possible analyses that we can do that reflect different things about what it is we observe in that. Some of those analyses reveal findings that are better for publication than others. I might very rapidly start to rationalize which of those analyses should we report. Well, obviously it's the one that shows the effect I have, and this is the reason why that's a better analysis, without realizing that it's because it reveals something that I want that I rationalize it to be a better analysis. We run lots of experiments in the lab. Only a subset of them end up being in the papers that we promote. What's the selection process to decide which of the studies end up in the paper and which ones are left out? Well, it may be that the ones that don't align with the other papers are ones I'm more likely to say, oh, I screwed up the methodology. That's why we didn't get the results there. So we can dismiss that experiment. It's a bad experiment without recognizing that, no, maybe it's a bad finding for me. And so that's why I'm rationalizing why I remove it. And so that discretion that we have then provides those opportunities. We have both motive and opportunity to do things that will undermine the credibility of the own work. And throughout that process, I am genuinely trying to figure things out that are true. I don't want to exploit all of that. But because there are such consequences for me and my career output, that I may not do it unwittingly. So there are lots of things we might describe as what then needs to be addressed. What could we change in the culture to try to improve the credibility of the research claims? For now, we suggest that it's three simple behaviors. Simple may be exaggerating. 3 behaviors that would be most relevant to trying to improve the credibility of claims, or at least to make it so that the credibility can be assessed accurately and reliably on an ongoing basis. right? Making the data and code available so that other people can see what it is you analyzed and can compare the decisions you made in that data with decisions they might have made using that same data. Assess the reproducibility and the robustness of those claims. What if you decided to analyze it these particular ways? I wouldn't have analyzed it that way. What happens if some other decisions are made? Is it robust to that? Second, open materials. If I can see how it is, the process, the procedure, the protocols, what you used to get your results, then it's easier for me to evaluate the actual process of doing research. And it's easier for me to then go and say, well, I want to try to replicate that in a different context and see if I'm able to reproduce the findings that you have. And so being able to access those materials facilitates that level of assessing credibility. And then finally, making commitments in advance. If I have a hypothesis to test, I have a reason that I'm doing this study, then I can very clearly distinguish what my plans are before I've seen the data from what I did once I saw the data. And that distinction is fundamental for being able to have diagnosticity of the statistical claims that we make from those planned analyses. The things that I commit to before seeing what the data are the things that are relevant for what it is a priori was expected. And all the things that I do with the data afterwards are very useful to do. All of that exploration, discovery that I do once I'm in the data, but they're necessarily we will be less confident in those claims because I'm interacting with the data in order to decide what I think might be happening in the data. And so I'm much more likely that I'm leveraging noise when I'm in exploratory mode of analysis. And so making it clear when I'm in one or the other is a mechanism for helping to clarify the credibility of this particular evidence given how it was generated. So we'd like to promote those three behaviors, but we're in a very difficult situation when you're trying to think about how do we change a research culture, because any given researcher has a unique constellation of stakeholders that influence her or his incentives in how it is they decide what to do in their research behavior. Right? Every given person has their own institution that they are housed in, the journals that they publish in, the funders that fund their work, and the societies that set the norms and standards for their particular area of work. And all of those are decentralized in the sense that there is no governing body that says these are the principles, this is how it is research gets done. So anything that we're going to try to do to try to shift those incentives to align those core values that people have with their everyday behaviors requires solving the coordination problem, getting all of these different kinds of communities to nudge their incentives just enough so that we are values aligned in what we're rewarding people for doing in their everyday behavior. And that's a hard problem. The coordination problem is very difficult, and it's particularly difficult because within each, there's also a coordination problem, right? How many universities are they? They all have ad hoc processes for these. So we can think about culture change in the same way that we think about diffusion of innovations of new technologies, right? This is a classic distribution generated by Rogers in the 1960s, elaborated on in the last 30 years or so, this is where the term early adopters was generated, where the idea of adoption of new technologies is that it goes through phases. And there's different types of people or different interests at different stages of a new technology being introduced for the motivations, the reasons why, what is it drives people to adopt those new technologies. Right? People who are way out the front end of adopting a new technology, the innovators, are people who are just excited about new things. I want to try this because it's new. And that's a core motivation for actually entering into a new space and being willing to test out and tolerate all the error-prone elements of new technologies. Early adopters can see the potential for this. They have the vision to say, oh, this is something that could help me solve these things, even though it may not be perfect yet, it is nevertheless something that I see as relevant for me, right? And as we get into the early and later majority, there's a lot more of how is it that this is functionally relevant for me? What is it that other people are doing? Why is it that I should also adopt this thing? Is it that I get some rewards for that? And of course, the laggards are like, no, I'm fine with my rotary phone. Rotary phones are fine. Why are people carrying their phones? It makes no sense, right? They just don't want to adopt new technologies. Okay. So we can think about this as an adoption process and for how it is we adopt new scientific culture behaviors, new behaviors that are what things that would promote greater transparency and reproducibility in research. And the way that we conceptualize the overall strategy for shifting a research culture can be encapsulated with this pyramid here. And the idea of the pyramid is that success at the higher levels of the pyramid are contingent on successful implementation at the lower levels of the pyramid. So at the base is infrastructure. You have to make it possible for researchers to do the new behaviors, or else how can they do the behaviors? Just having that infrastructure can be sufficient for some to then start to initiate those behaviors. Ideally, those behaviors would be easy to apply because they get integrated into researcher workflows, how it is that they do their work. And one of the big challenges for behavior change among researchers is that every researcher has their own idiosyncratic way of doing their work, the own set of technologies that they use in order to support that work. And so if you can't have behavior change mechanisms that adapt to or flexible to those different idiosyncratic workflows, it's going to be very hard to get people to adopt new behaviors. Likewise, people are busy. Researchers have a lot to do. And so if we introduce a solution that is, for example, we want you to share everything that you've done in your work, and the way that we implement that as a process is that after you get the paper published, then we have this whole additional process where now you have to figure out how to share your data and your code and your materials and everything else. That's a good way to minimize uptake of that new behavior because I don't have time for this additional thing. And I already got the reward that I need, which is the paper. That's what I needed. Now doing all this extra stuff is not relevant for my rewards. Beyond making it easy, showing that others in your community are doing those behaviors is really important for shifting norms. Norms have an enormous impact on behavior in general, but particularly on research behaviors, because how is it that we learn what it is that a good scientist does? We look to others within our communities for what they do. And those behaviors inform what it is that's the normative way of acting for this kind of work. And so making behaviors that are desirable behaviors visible, making it so you can see that others are doing these behaviors, is a good way to facilitate normative adoption of those behaviors. On top of that are the incentives. It needs to be in my interest to do those behaviors. So by making the incentives aligned, if I need a publication, then maybe the things that I need to do to get that publication should reinforce the values that we have so that the incentive is aligned with the values themselves rather than being at odds with one another. And then finally, making it required, right? Just imposing a policy. A funder says, in order to get our money, you need to commit to sharing your data, sharing your code, et cetera, is the way to ensure that all of these occur. But a successful policy without a community embracing it and showing what the norms are, or without a good infrastructure to help support the behavior, will be a failed policy. People will do it as a bureaucratic burden rather than as a mechanism of good practice. And so effective policies require that you get all of these things implemented well. It doesn't mean it has to come last, but it has to come in concert with interventions that are addressing the normative factors within the research community so that that policy is embraced rather than just seen as a hassle. So that adoption curve that I showed on the previous slide, we can rotate and impose right on those same requirements for how it is that research culture change can happen most effectively. Right? For the innovators, just making those new behaviors possible can be sufficient. Right? They don't need the incentives or the rewards or the norms. They are trying the behaviors because they're excited about the behaviors for their own sake. Right? Making it easy can facilitate that adoption into early adopters because you can integrate it into their workflows. And so they can see how it is that I could adopt that behavior and what value it has for things that I'm trying to do. Making those early adopters and innovators visible. So you see the people out front are leading these behaviors. They're showing that these behaviors are not just possible, but they're also providing value for them and their research, can facilitate the early majority to say, oh, this is a thing we do now. And I see why we're doing it. Okay, and I see that maybe I should do it too. And so they're influenced by the adoption by others. And the great thing about norms is that they become compounding. The more that people do it, the more that people do it. and the more it's hard to not do it. And so that can really facilitate adoption into the mainstream. Some will still be not quite influenced by the norms because they say, well, yeah, it's great that other people are doing that, but the rewards are still about these behaviors, so I have to do these behaviors. And so shifting those incentives, making it rewarding to do the behaviors will help bring most of the mainstream along. And then the laggards, just, you got to do it now. You want the money, you got to do it. Okay, I'll do it. Okay, so that in conceptual terms is how we think about culture change in terms of the research culture. So what I want to do for the rest of the time is just give some illustrative examples of how we're trying to use those principles in actual interventions to see if we can shift some behaviors in the research culture. And I want to start with the simplest one, which is signaling when the behaviors happen. So a community of researchers develop these badges and the specifications for what it means to earn that badge. What does it mean to have open data or open materials or pre-registered research? And we made these badges available to journals to adopt so that when you as an author get your article accepted at the journal says, hey, if you're interested, we have these badges that we'll put on your article. If you meet the criteria, then they'll appear on the article and then we'll put a link to the data or the materials of the pre-registration. And then that will signal that you did those behaviors, and then other people that are readers might be interested in following up on what materials you have available. Now that is a small incentive for the researcher, right? It's just a badge on the paper, but really the paper is what counts for them. But what it also is it's a signal for the community that reads that journal. If they see that there are other people doing these behaviors, which are otherwise relatively invisible, then it makes it a lot easier for people in that community to say, oh, this is something maybe that happens in my field now. And then if that facilitates more people doing it, then people will notice, oh, more people are doing this behavior in my community. Maybe it's a thing we do now. And that will facilitate more people doing it. So the obvious question is something that trivial, something that is effective in actually changing research behaviors? So the first journal that adopted the badges was Psychological Science, adopted January 1st, 2014. What I'm showing you here is the 2 years prior to Psych Science adopting it in 6-month intervals. And in black is the rates of sharing data across the articles published in that journal by Psychological Science. And in gray are 4 comparison journals over the same time period. So Psych Science adopts badges January 1st, 2014. And then this is what happens in the next 18 months. So less than 3% of articles were open data prior to adopting badges. Then they introduced the new policy, and within 18 months, 39% of the articles have open data. That's 2015. 2019, the rates of data sharing of badges in Psych Science is over 80%. So it isn't that the badge is extraordinarily powerful. It's that the badge provides a signal of what the rest of the community is doing. And as people start to adopt that behavior, then that visibility shows people that these are things that people in my community are doing now. And that visibility has a compounding effect. And so when the values are already there for the behavior, sometimes a very small intervention is sufficient to create a dramatic change. If we were trying to get people to do behavior that they don't value, then this would very unlikely to succeed. Wow, there are people that are real jerks in our field doing a behavior that I don't like. I'm definitely not going to do that. Maybe I should leave the field. Right? So instead, signaling when the things are valued is a very effective way to get other people to say, oh, that's a thing that I like, and other people are doing it. Maybe I will too. Okay, that's one example. Another strategy for developing norms is to have initiatives that get people's attention about something that they may know, but not think there's any way to actually do the behavior in an effective way. And so we've organized the special issues of journals where certain kinds of things that don't ordinarily get published are highlighted as important to publish. And so this is the most recent one that we launched with the Flu Lab and PLOS, where it's a call for people to pull out all those negative results that they have in their file drawers that they've never published. if they've done replications and didn't bother to try to publish them, take those out. We're inviting those. And in fact, what we want you to do is submit new ideas for replications that we will review and fund so that we can get replications of important results in influenza research. And so organizing a campaign around a theme that is one of the themes that people have recognized might be something that isn't yet incentivized gives people some initial evidence that, oh, this is a thing that can be valued, and that's a thing that can be rewarded. And the outputs of it allow for that to foment in the field. We did a similar one of these in 2014 in social psychology. We organized a special issue of replications of important results in social psychology. And for the journal that sponsored the special issue, that particular issue is the most cited issue. The articles in that issue are the most cited articles of any issue they've ever published. So people were convinced very rapidly that replication isn't just boring or unpublishable or not something that people pay attention to, but actually something that can be rewarded if the work is good, because it helps provide information that deals with the credibility of the claims in those papers. Okay, want to move to an example that's focused on the incentives, aligning the incentives that drive researchers with the values that we have, those behaviors that we're hoping researchers will adopt. And our core incentive, as we've argued, is publication. We're not going to get rid of that as an incentive easily, and maybe we shouldn't get rid of it because it is a mechanism of communication. It's a mechanism of output. There are relevant things for publishing that are about evaluating researchers. But maybe we can nudge the incentives of what gets published and how one gets published so that it is values aligned with the behaviors. And so this is a cartoon version of how research gets done, right? You design a study, you collect and analyze data, write the report, and then publish it. But of course, it's not that simple. There's also this big barrier of peer review after the report is written before it's published. Now, in the normal case, here, I have to make that report as beautiful as possible so that eventually some subset of reviewers will relent and say, okay, fine, publish it. Sent it to the 17th journal, we're fine, just stop bothering us, publish it. So the problem with that, of course, is that the peer reviewers are in my way. They're an antagonist to my incentive, and the research is all done. And so anything that they point out about its limitations are things that I cannot do much about because the research is finished. And so I have all of my incentives are to make it as publishable as possible and minimize the things that would interfere with that publishability. The concept of register reports makes one fundamental change to that process, and it's to move peer review to after the design phase. So when you submit a register report to a journal, what you submit is, here's the research question that I have, here's the methodology that I'm going to use to test that question, and maybe here's some preliminary studies or evidence to show that it's a viable direction to go, right? The exploratory work that I did at the outset. Then the reviewers review the methodology and the question. They say, is this an important question? Do we need to know the answer to this? And is this an effective design, a test to that question, where we'll learn something from the outcome? But we don't know what the outcome is yet. If it passes peer review at that phase, then the journal gives in-principle acceptance. If you follow through with all of the feedback that we have, the design as you committed to it, as we agreed, then we will publish it regardless of the outcome. And then at the second phase of review after the report is not a review based on are we interested in the result or not. It's a review saying, did you follow through with what you said you were going to do? Did you do the methodology effectively? If it's the neuroimaging study, did you remember to turn on the magnet when you ran the study, right? Whatever things are fundamentals to just executing the research well. There's a whole bunch of things that change in the incentives here, right? One of them, for me as an author, is it's no longer about me getting beautiful results, which is the one part I'm not supposed to be able to control. It's about me designing beautiful studies and testing important questions that need to be answered. And so the incentives are design the most important studies possible. Second thing is it builds in pre-registration to the process. So I am pre-committing to what are the things that I'm going to test. And so by doing that, I have a very clear section of the final paper that are the confirmatory tests, the things that I can make diagnostic statistical inferences about in that paper based on the plan before I had the results. And then I have a separate section, which is the exploratory stuff. Okay, we unpack the data, we analyze it this way and this way and this way, and here's some new things that we think are interesting to follow up on. But that's clearly distinguished from the stuff that was pre-committed to in advance. The third thing is that when the peer reviewers point out all the dumb things that I did in the design, I don't say, you're a jerk. I say, oh, thank you, we'll revise our design. Because I can update it because I haven't run the experiments yet. And so they become much more like collaborators in the process rather than antagonists to the process. And then finally, this has a change dynamic for peer reviewers as well. When I'm a peer reviewer in the normal phase, and they send stuff to me that is relevant to my work. And so sometimes the stuff that is sent to me shows, after, of course, I check whether they cited me, I check what the results were. And if the results are antagonistic to claims I've made previously, I find all kinds of problems with the design. Oh, this is terrible. I can't make any sense of this because the methodology is bad. If the findings are something that are aligned with things that I've claimed before, it's a great method. This is publish this with all speed. Right? So peer reviewers also have incentives to suppress or support findings that are more or less convenient to them and their own point of view. At this phase, nobody knows what the results are. So peer reviewers, even antagonistic peer reviewers in a contentious area, can be collaborative on this is the design that will finally show that I'm right and you're wrong. And everybody believes that they're right and they're wrong. So there's much more opportunity for that to actually be collaborative when you don't know what the results are. Of course, in experience, we've had about 200 of these published so far. In experience, people still think they're right and the others are wrong after the fact. But it's a little bit more obvious that there is more motivated reasoning happening there. Okay, so this model we have, I don't know if I have a slide of results. Oh yeah, so there are about 200 journals that have adopted register reports as a publishing model, mostly in the social behavioral sciences and neuroscience, but increasingly in other fields as well. We can see from those early results that it is having the impact that we would expect it to have. So what I'm showing you here is the percentage of null findings from the traditional literature in these fields, which is only about 10% of primary findings in published articles in these fields are negative results, right? 90% positive results. We're usually right about everything we claim. With register reports, whether they're replication studies or testing novel findings, the percentage of null findings is about 60%. So many more null findings are getting into the literature with register reports because we've pre-committed to publishing them without knowing what the results would be. That is illustrating, we presume, the publication bias, selective reporting that occurs in the traditional literature. Now, when we show this graph to editors that haven't yet adopted register reports, some of them look at it and say, that's why I'm not going to adopt registered reports. I don't want all these negative results in my journal. No one will ever cite them. I'll be the one that ruined the impact factor of my journal, and then I will lose my reputation. And whether we agree or not that impact factor should be the way that journals are evaluated, it is at least a reasonable hypothesis to think the reason that we don't see negative results in literature is because no one cares about them and they're actually not helpful. So one obvious question to test is, are these papers less cited than these papers? And that turns out not to be true, at least so far. If they were equally cited, you would see all of these, Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, at 100, right? Equivalent citation of comparable articles came out at the same time in those journals with the register reports. If anything, we see trends for the register reports to be cited more than the comparable articles in the same journals. We can only speculate why that occurs and if it will persist. But my speculation for why it occurs is that when you are committing in advance to the idea that this is an interesting question and an interesting methodology, and we want to know the answer, then any answer is actually an important answer. If it's a negative result, it's just as informative as if it was a positive result because we didn't know the answer beforehand. And the methodologies tend to be much better, I hypothesize, for the registered reports because they're getting peer reviewed in advance. And a lot of the feedback is about how can you make this design as robust and effective and credible as possible for the claims that you're testing. Whereas in the traditional literature, you have a terrible design, but you still get that amazing result. People say, wow, I can't believe you got that amazing result with that terrible methodology. And so it could still be potentially publishable. So we'll see how that plays out over time. Okay, last one is just an illustration at the policy level. With a collaborative group of multiple stakeholders, publishers, funders, society leaders, and researchers, we developed the top guidelines, transparency and openness promotion guidelines, with the goal of providing a framework of what does it mean to be more transparent with your work across the various activities in the research lifecycle. And if we can provide a framework that can be applied across stakeholder groups and across disciplines, then it makes it a lot easier for people to adopt standards and apply those standards in a very general way. And so these are 8 different categories that comprise the guidelines. And a journal or a funder or an institution can adopt those guidelines and then adopt a level of stringency for each of those that is relevant for their context. And that level of stringency, just for example, for data transparency, could be at level 1, disclosure. You're not required to share your data because our field isn't quite ready for that. We just want you to say whether or not your data are shared somewhere. And if it is shared somewhere, you have to say where. Right? So a disclosure of whether the data are available. A level 2 of data transparency would be it's required that you share the data unless you meet one of these exceptions, right? It's human subjects data, you can't, the identifying part you can't share, or it's intellectual property concerns, and so you can't share that in this context. But otherwise, it's required to share. And then the third level, the top level, is not only do you have to share the data, but you have to share it in a way that we can reproduce the findings from the paper to see that these data reproduce the claims that you make in the paper. That's a high level of expectation, but there are a few journals in politics and economics that are applying even that level of stringency. You have to submit your data in code. Editor has to be able to hit run in the analytics program and see that all of the findings from your paper are reproducible. So that as a guideline is very useful to try to get alignment across these different stakeholders, right? That key problem of coordination across all of these communities is a big barrier to getting culture change to happen. And so the guidelines provide a framework for that. And at this point, all of the major publishers have endorsed the guidelines. More than 1,000 journals have implemented those guidelines in their policies. And now funders are starting to adapt their policies incrementally toward these guidelines. That also then provides a mechanism for us to use the same principles of norms for journals to be comparing against each other. What is it that journals need to do? Well, I don't know. I look, what should our policies be? I look to my peers of other editors at other journals that are like mine to see what they do. And so what we've been putting together over time is these charts of adoption. Remember I said there was 3 levels. You can adopt disclosure or requirement or verification, or you adopt no policy at all, which gets you a score of 0. And so we can just do a simple mapping of what the leading journals have done for their adoption of the different policies. And then have they adopted register reports? Have they adopted badges, et cetera? And then we make this, I'm showing you the top list here of the top social psychology journals, which is the area that's done the most reform so far. And we can send a list of 30 journals from that discipline to all of the editors. Say, thought you might want to know what it is that the policies are across these different journals. And just sending that email with a link to this chart gets all of the journals down here to say, oh, wait a second. We're the ones that are down at the bottom of this list. That doesn't feel right. And so it's been, in our initial tests, very effective as a normative influence to get additional journals to strengthen their policies for transparency. Okay, so I just want to close with a couple of examples showing that behavior is changing. And this is just using the convenience of the infrastructure that we operate, the open science framework that provides that base of that pyramid, right? Infrastructure to make it possible to do all these behaviors and working on making that easy to use so people can integrate it into their workflows. And this is just illustrating that since we launched in 2012, the number of users that have joined the system. This is our presumed number. It's going to be 100, I think it's about 174,000 today but by the end of 2019, we expect to be at close to 200,000. And then the number of registrations. People can pre-register their research on the site. And this is just showing the nonlinear growth rate in that on the service. So, but these, for what science is, those are obviously drops in the bucket. And there are many different services that are trying to promote better open practices across the research life cycle. But to really solve it, it's not sufficient to just build a service and hope that people will use it. It requires addressing those cultural challenges by coordinating across all of these different institutions and systems. So to the extent that you have places where you see opportunities for groups in your discipline to shift their practices, if you are an editor, if you know editors, if you know funders, these are places where we are very delighted to collaborate, to help make little nudges and pushes, share with them information about the things that they can be doing to promote greater transparency and reproducibility. So I will close with a few links for including these slides. If you want access to those, they are available right there. And I'll be happy to have discussion and questions for whatever time we have left. So thanks very much for coming.
I don't know why I have a feeling that you're going to have a long discussion session after this.
Good.
Why? Sorry, everybody's going to have a chance.
Thanks for a great talk. And I'm wondering what your thoughts about like data science or like the field where you work with more found data rather than like done data. Like I think sometimes true registration doesn't make much sense in some cases, and sometimes the process is highly tricky.
Yeah.
And what your thoughts about pre-registration in the context?
Yeah, it's a great question. And lots of research applications are with existing data in different ways. And inevitably, that creates greater challenge for credibility because the more that you know about the data, the more likely you are to leverage the idiosyncratic noise in that data to maximize claims. And so the ideal case of I design the experiment and then collect new data is the ideal case for strength of inference. But there are lots of things that one can do to maximize the strength of inference for existing data content. So there's, and these issues are well known in these fields, right? So the overfitting is a strong concern. And so the kinds of behaviors that can help that are related to pre-registration is whatever you can plan in advance that is unknown still has value in improving the credibility of those claims compared to not doing it. So it may not be the ideal case, but it is better than the worst case, which is just keep analyzing the data till you get what you want and then report that. So any pre-commitment is better than that. So that is answer one, which is pre-registration is relevant to the extent that you can minimize, you can reduce from what you would otherwise do. Second answer is that we can split data, and this is a very common thing to do in many data science applications, into the training and validation sets. Right? So we can enable very exploratory approaches up front, commit to models, pre-register those models, and then test them on separate data sets. The third answer is that in some cases we just know too much about the data, and so we aren't going to be able to really be confident into pre-registration in a way that we might be blind to what the outcomes are. Probably the most effective intervention in that case is to do a multiverse analysis, where there are many choices I could make about how to analyze this data. Many of those choices are reasonable choices. So analyze it all the ways and show how much the different choices one makes are impacting the actual outcome. And if you can show that no matter which way I analyze it, or 80% of the ways that I could analyze this, it comes out with this kind of effect of this magnitude. That shows the robustness of the finding that it wouldn't have mattered how it is analyzed. And so that's probably the most effective solution when there's a lot more. Thanks for the question.
I wanted to let you know your mic has been turned off, which will affect people who are calling her.
Yeah, I think the battery's there.
I think the battery's out.
At least that's what it says.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll stand here. So now I have to wave from here. Okay.
I'm sorry, it's a very nice lecture.
but you couldn't reproduce, I don't know, 50%, 40% of the things. So my first point is that what you have done, of course, I can see how you would work in the social, political, psychological sciences. But in the physical and biological sciences, often to try to reproduce, to try to do a check on anything, it's very difficult. Sometimes the equipment is millions of dollars.
Yeah.
The materials are thousands of dollars. And I tell you this, I have had this experience. Why don't you check this to see if it's true? He said, well, no, it's too expensive. If I prove that it's right, I cannot publish it. If I prove it's wrong, what do I gain?
Yeah.
So what happens in the physical and biological sciences, I don't see it as clear as what you have described here in the more social science.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, is what happens in the biological and physical sciences, or more particularly when the experiments themselves or the research itself is very resource intensive. And so there are a couple of things. The second part of your comment is a real comment about the social system, which is why would I even bother trying to reproduce when it's going to be that much effort and a very uncertain reward? So that's a key problem. And part of that, those special issue initiatives where we say in advance, this is a call for replications in this area. And in fact, we provide funding for those replications, is a way to try to intervene on that part of the challenge. The technical part of the challenge, or instrumentation part of the challenge, is also a big one. So we have just completed a reproducibility project in cancer biology, and we're writing the final reports now. It was very hard to do that project compared to the replication projects in psychology that we did. Very hard, like way more money, way more challenging. And we started with 51 papers and 197 experiments that we were going to try to reproduce. One of the first things that we assessed was, can we figure out how to do the experiment by reading the paper? Do we have enough information to be able to reproduce the methodology? Guess how many of the experiments we were able to figure out just from reading the paper how to do them? 0, not 1. 0, did we have no questions for the original authors for getting clarifications on the reagents, the methods, the dosage, all sorts of things that are fundamental details for doing the research. So already there's a barrier just in reporting. And then of course, it's the instrumentation, the expertise, and everything else. So we started with 51 papers, 197 experiments. We finished 17 papers and 52, I think, experiments. Right? And that's just even being able to do the experiment, not to say nothing of what the findings in those were. So the issues that you point out are real, and I think they're even bigger in the context where redoing the experiment is itself a feasibility challenge, whereas we've selected things where it's relatively feasible. There's also potentially variation in the extent to which this is a challenge, but we don't know. Are some fields less reproducible than others? And there are good reasons to expect that might be true, and there's good reasons to expect it may not be as big as we might think. Right? The good reason to think that it might be general is that everybody is in the same incentive environment. Right? Everybody has to find, no matter what field you're in, it's very competitive, and getting more positive, more clean, more tidy, more novel results is more rewarded. And so that incentive driver seems to be universal. What might make it more challenging in some fields relative to others, and there's lots of hypotheses, but the one I'm most convinced by is the extent to which a negative result is meaningful. And in particular, I mean, does it violate a theoretical expectation in a way that people would take seriously? Right? But, the faster than light neutrinos, right? Everybody said, wait a second, right? We're going to replicate that because that makes no sense. The CERN is a perfect example, right? There's 2 teams. We need to do this right to get Higgs boson. So we're going to do it in 2 teams and we're going to reproduce it. But of course, if you have, how many billions of dollars did it cost? A lot of billions of dollars. So there can be those investments. But there's a lot of areas of science where not getting a result is seen as very meaningful. Wait a second, we had strong reasons to believe that. And there are areas that have much looser theories, right? And a lot of the kind of work that I do, if you don't get a result, everybody says, well, I don't know, right? It's not that it validated a theory. It's like, oh, maybe that's not something that happened. Okay, we just move on. It's an outlier of many kinds. And so that, I think, is a real barrier to getting to reproducible findings, because you don't quite know how to interpret all the results if you don't have strong theory. So thanks for the question. Yeah, good question. So there's two different answers to that. Well, there's just too much to read if we also start publishing the negative results. There's already too much to read. You can't read all the positive results. So as I recall, infinity plus infinity is still infinity. And it is effectively already infinity for every individual reader. So that's a glib way of saying, well, yeah, the problem is not that the results, there's too many results. It's that our filters, our search and discovery mechanisms are not effective enough to help us to sort through that, to be able to get the results that we need to assess the credibility of particular claims. And I think that's a technological problem rather than we shouldn't publish certain kinds of things problem. It's we need to improve our filters, our discovery mechanisms. And there's lots of great work happening to try to improve that by many different groups. But the second part of it is, yeah, maybe some stuff won't get published. If we keep the regime of how we have it, this certain number of journals and a limited number of stuff gets into those journals, then there should be ways to discover the rest of it. And the primary mechanism to ensure that is registration. So I talked about pre-registration primarily in terms of improving diagnosticity of the statistical claims. But the other role of registration is to eliminate publication bias. If I put in the registry every study as I'm about to do it, then in principle, every study that my lab does is discoverable, whatever it ends up happening to it.
The pre-register cannot be open. That's got to be highly confidential, because if I sit down and design a killer experiment, I sure as hell don't want the rest of the world knowing
Yeah,
before I do it.
because you must have brilliant ideas and everybody was waiting to steal them. Right.
Foobar is critical in obesity.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how stupid that idea is. I don't want anybody else knowing about that foobar until I've done that experiment.
Yeah.
That's $1 billion a year.
Yeah.
5%. So
yeah, that
there's
important.
no way that-
So
plus the pre-register judges are going to be my competitors in most journals.
So you're talking about registered reports. Let's distinguish registered reports from pre-registration. So registered reports is a special case of pre-registration where you submit to the journal and get review and pre-commitment. Pre-registration is a behavior that you can do for any research separate from a journal, which is you submit to a registry your research plan and timestamp it so that you know what you plan in advance. But the solution for the concern that you raise is that not all registries, but OSF is our registry I showed the data for, you can embargo your registration for up to 4 years. So you can say, I have a brilliant idea. My competitors are going to steal all my ideas. Turns out that doesn't happen, but let's assume that it happens. Then you can embargo it so that you have the time to make sure that you have the chance to get the research done before others discover it. But after 4 years, it's still discoverable, right? And so that you can always end up finding whatever the results were, regardless of whether they're in the paper or not. So it's a good issue to raise.
That assumes that after you've registered or pre-registered or whatever your nomenclature is, that when the experiment is done, it gets published.
It doesn't require that. It does require that if the ideal is that the results get reported, it could be in a publication. It can be just with the registry. So all of the registries allow outcome reporting. No, it's right in the registry. Here's the registration. Here's the data. Yeah, although it gets harder and easier depending on where you put it.
If you put it up on your own server and just make sure Google knows it's there, that's as good as putting it on Nature.
It's not as good because once you die, that page goes away. And so if we want to preserve, yeah, Nature may die too, but there are organizations that are oriented toward preservation. And so most of the services that do registry kinds of work try to guarantee the preservation of that material. So Right, universities are a great example. Libraries care about this, museums care about it. So there are infrastructures that try to maximize that the preservation and the discoverability of that kind of work. So.
Preprints have in changing the culture, and do you have any data that indicate that our culture research is changing as a result of people uploading?
Yeah, preprints is a great example of change in increasing transparency more quickly. And there's a couple of impacts of preprints, right? One is that anybody can discover because they're open. All preprint services are open services for now. So hopefully they will remain that way. But the goal being anybody that wants to discover the research can. Also as an accelerant, right? Research is available sooner to be able to evaluate. And it can flip the publication and evaluation orientation, right? So we can share the work and then build evaluation systems that are focused on saying whether that work is worth taking seriously and being more adaptive over time to emerging understanding of that work. So when it's published, it is static in time. It's treated as a unit, and that's how it is forever. With preprint services, now we can experiment with that. And so on our, we host 24 preprint services on the OSF, and they are for lots of different communities. And with those services, we have lots of experimentation happening of, well, let's just keep posting update revisions to the paper, even after it's published. We found out something else. Why not post a revision? As long as you can see the version history, you can see the evolution of those ideas over time. So there's lots of opportunities to really exploit that change in the model, to embrace the fact that the science is uncertain, the science is evolving, and scholarly communication should be able to support that, not inhibit that as the traditional publication structure has. So thanks for that.
So I would say we might have time for one more question, and then after we do have
We have a reception here, so we can.
we do have a reception that'll be here.
Yes.
Great.
So we're going to have a chance to talk right after that. Please last question then. Sorry about the other.
So some fields are less focused on like journals and are more doing like conference papers, and there's a lot of that sort of thing. So I'm curious if you've done any work or have any thoughts about how to bring theoretical registration into that sort of area as well.
Yeah, good question. So many areas in engineering or computer science focus on conference proceedings more so than the journals to varying extents. The principles are broadly applicable, and there's even some initial experiments of trying things like registered reports for conference submissions themselves. So a couple of conferences have tried this out. I haven't heard reports back on how well it went, but it's cool that they're trying it out. But I think that these are broadly applicable because they're really at the high level of how it is the research process works, which is what have you planned before you've analyzed the data and what happens after you analyze the data as one simple point in time. And what is great, I think, about all of the different experiments that are happening in the open science movement is that we are injecting the possibility for evaluation, for peer review, to not just happen at the end, the conclusion of the work, but at any point in the review process. So there are lots of really interesting examples of peer review happening during grant development, right? During writing the grant, of others jumping in and giving feedback and challenging it, et cetera. Or during the design of the experiment. We run these large replications and we have reviewers and collaborators, both, critiquing the design as we're writing the design. So even further back than the register reports idea of why not just be involved while we're doing it. So there's lots of things that could be experimented with at different stages of the life cycle to see how best to maximize that exchange of information, of critique back and forth. And I think that I don't know what's going to be the best. But the fact that we now have a community that is actually trying things, testing things, and then evaluating their effectiveness is very promising, I think, instead of just saying, well, this is how the system works, so we're going to work within the system. So thanks for the question.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.